1998, Naughty Dog faced a hardware-defined ceiling. The original PlayStation had no Z buffering and a brutal 2 MB VRAM limit. To get a high-speed platformer running at a consistent 30 frames per second, they couldn't build a true, open 3D environment. Instead, they built a masterpiece of optical illusion. Crash Bandicoot 3, Warped is the technical pinnacle of that illusion. The game feels massive, but it's actually a series of strictly contained tubes. By forcing the player into narrow, linear corridors, the engine only ever needed to render what was directly in front of the camera. This allowed Naughty Dog to allocate their remaining processing budget to high-poly character models and complex environmental assets that shouldn't have been possible on this hardware. But this wasn't just about rendering tricks. The genius here lies in the dynamic LOD, level of detail, system. As you sprint through a level, the game is constantly streaming assets and discarding them millisecond by millisecond. If the streaming timing was off by even a few cycles, you'd see a screen tear or a pop-in. While our upscaled capture cleans up the classic hardware limitations, eliminating the texture jitter that plagued the original PS1 release, the underlying logic remains a masterclass in memory management. In this breakdown, we're not looking at the fun factor. We're looking at the data streams. How did they hide the limitations of the console to create one of the fastest, most responsive platformers of the 32-bit era? This is the forensic breakdown of Crash Bandicoot 3, Warped. If you strip away the textures, the levels aren't 3D environments, they are essentially linear arrays of coordinate points. The engine uses a pre-computed visibility graph. Because Crash cannot deviate from his path, the engine knows exactly which objects, platforms, and hazards will come into the player's frustum, the camera's field of view, at every specific X, Y, Z coordinate. This allowed Naughty Dog to execute hard-coded culling. Instead of the PlayStation spending precious GPU cycles checking if a crate behind a wall was visible, the engine simply deleted it from memory as soon as the player crossed a predefined invisible trigger plane. One of the biggest visual bottlenecks for the PS1 was the overhead of animating full 3D skeletons. Moving every vertex in a complex character model like Crash's in real time was incredibly expensive. To bypass this, they implemented a hybrid vertex interpolation system. The problem, rigid 3D limbs looked robotic and disconnected at the joints. The Naughty Dog workaround, they used a custom vertex skinning math that allowed for pseudo-smooth joint deformation. It wasn't true modern skeletal rigging, but it applied a weighted rotation to the joint vertices based on the limb's movement vector. When Crash spins, the engine isn't just playing an animation file. It is calculating the vector shift for the torso vertices, applying a rotation matrix to the limb vertices, and snapping the model to the ground plane, all in a single frame. This is why the spin move feels so weighty and responsive compared to other platformers of the era. The model is physically tracking its collision volume against the environment geometry, rather than just playing an animation loop. The theme of Crash 3, the Warp Room, wasn't just a stylistic choice, it was a clever way to mask the disk seat time. On original PlayStation hardware, the CD-ROM drive was the single biggest bottleneck. Loading a new environment took time. By centralizing the game in the Warp Room, Naughty Dog created a hub where they could keep the central character model and common assets loaded into RAM, while the disk drive acted as a background streaming device for the specific level data. The technical reality, whenever you enter a level portal, the screen fades to black not for dramatic effect, but to clear the previous level's geometry buffer from the 2 MB VRAM and stream in the new assets. Our 1080p upscaling makes these transitions feel snappier, but the original disk loading cycle is still technically the timer that dictates the pace of the game. This combination of path-constrained visibility and hub-based asset streaming allowed Crash 3 to push far more visual data than the hardware was ever officially rated to handle. It is a perfect example of developers coding against the limitations of the hardware until the hardware stopped behaving like a console and started behaving like a specialized rendering engine. understand the evolution of Crash Bandicoot 3, Warped, you have to look at the trajectory of Naughty Dog's internal development philosophy between 1996 and 1998. They weren't just making a sequel, they were engaged in an aggressive, iterative optimization loop that defined the mid-PS1 era. In the early days of the original Crash Bandicoot, the team was essentially performing field research on the PlayStation's hardware. They were learning what the memory could handle and how much geometry they could shove through the CPU without a total engine crash. By the time they reached Warped, Naughty Dog had transitioned from making it work to exploiting the hardware. By Warped, the GOOL, Game Object-Oriented Lisp, engine had matured from a basic geometry renderer into a full-scale asset management system. This maturity is exactly why Warped feels so much faster than its predecessors. The engine was no longer struggling to keep the world visible, it was now optimized to stream massive variations in gameplay logic, like underwater physics or motorcycle handling, without needing a full system reboot between segments. The first two Crash games were defined by a singular focus, linear, precision platforming. However, Naughty Dog recognized a critical data trend in their playtesting: players were hitting a repetition wall. The core platforming loop was airtight, but it lacked the mechanical variety needed to sustain a long-form experience. For Warped, the development team effectively split the game's core loop into two distinct mechanical pillars. The precision core, the classic, high-speed platforming that defined the series. The contextual variation, using the warp room to inject distinct, genre-shifting gameplay loops: the jet ski, the motorcycle, the plane, and the tiger. This wasn't just adding minigames. It was a massive technical risk. Every time you shift from Crash's standard platforming movement to the motorcycle, you are essentially loading a completely different physics model into the same memory footprint. The technical hurdle: a motorcycle requires a totally different collision calculation than a bipedal character. The team had to build a physics swapper within the GOOL engine that could unload Crash's walking jumping logic and load the motorcycle's velocity and steering logic without bloating the memory usage beyond the 2 MB VRAM limit. The new features, like the double jump, the fruit bazooka, and the super spin, were not just design flourishes. They were direct responses to the feedback that the original games were too punishing. However, adding these features actually complicated the development cycle. Every new ability Crash gained required a corresponding increase in the level's mechanical complexity. If Crash can double jump, the level designers can create wider gaps. If Crash has a bazooka, the developers have to code long-range enemy awareness that wasn't necessary in Crash 1. The reason Warped feels so cohesive is that Naughty Dog balanced these new abilities against the existing memory budget by reusing assets in clever ways. Look closely at the levels. The amount of texture repetition and environmental asset recycling is high, but the interaction logic, what happens when you spin a crate, how the bazooka affects a shield, is what keeps it fresh. They traded environmental variety for gameplay variety, a classic move in hardware-constrained development. By 1998, Naughty Dog had reached the logical conclusion of the original PlayStation platform. Warped remains the definitive PS1 Swan song because it shows a developer who had finally mastered the hardware so completely that they could afford to break their own rules. They didn't just iterate on the previous two entries, they used the lessons from them to build an engine capable of handling almost anything they threw at it. It was the final, triumphant stress test of the PlayStation's architecture before Naughty Dog pivoted their focus toward the PS2 and the birth of Jak and Daxter. Crash Bandicoot 3, Warped is rarely discussed as a technical marvel in the same breath as late-era PS2 or early PS3 titles, and that is a mistake. It is the definitive example of the optimization peak. Naughty Dog didn't have the benefit of more powerful hardware, they simply learned how to command the existing silicon with ruthless efficiency. While our modern emulation setups allow us to remove the polygon jitter and texture warping that defined the 32-bit aesthetic, that clarity actually highlights the genius of the original design. The collision math, the streaming corridors, and the hybrid animation blending weren't just good for 1998, they were a perfectly calculated solution to a set of brutal hardware constraints. Walt marks the moment where Naughty Dog stopped fighting the PlayStation's memory limits and started orchestrating them. It is a masterclass in how to build a high-speed, varied experience by leveraging strictly defined rendering windows and intelligent asset recycling. It's easy to dismiss classic platformers as simple fun, but when you look at the raw data, the streaming architecture, and the sheer optimization required to get this running on a CD-based console, it's clear this was engineering as much as it was art.